So I'm actually going to start with the second part. So one of my go-to statements is that poetry is the voice of the people. And I say that because if you look back at history, before most men were able to read and write, we had poetry. And poetry was a way that people were able to convey information from one village to the next village. And I say that because we used the poetic devices such as meter and rhyme to help remember the stories or the news that they wanted to carry that message to the next village. And so as poetry being the voice of the people, the common man, that is one of the things that drives my poetry. I believe that the themes of poetry can be anything that would invite the common man into wanting to convey a message that has emotional appeal to other common men. And that's what really drives it. So some of the themes that I've written about and taken time to write about is growing up in foster care. So I grew up in foster care, and my very first collection of poetry is called Unadoptable Joy, and it's all about growing up in foster care. I aged out of the system and went on to college, and I was the first person in the family that I continue to consider my family, because I was able to get into a foster home that was a permanent foster home for several years, a long time. And I have that as my biological family now of choice, and was able to continue to make those family connections with somebody. Like, some foster children do not get that opportunity. My second book, though, was called Homeless Joy, because even as an adult, there are struggles that we go through. And so from being a foster child and being homeless, because it was wherever I was appointed to sleep that night, and sometimes it was in an office, and sometimes it was on someone's couch, and sometimes it was at a relative's house for a single night. I was a homeless individual, and as an adult I also became a homeless individual. And so Homeless Joy explored not only my story of being homeless, but I also did a lot of interviews of homeless individuals, and I wrote an expose on homelessness in combination of poetry and prose. My third book is a celebration of the last 10 years of my life or so, because I was able to semi-retire and live in an RV for 4.5 years and travel the United States. So I've been in all 49 states I could drive to. The RV didn't float, so I never got to Hawaii. And and the time I was scheduled to go to Hawaii, the pandemic hit. So yeah, it was the only state I still haven't been to. It's still on the plans to go there. But the last poetry collection is poems and photographs, because I love taking photographs. It's another form of art that goes really well with poetry, and it allows people to connect in a pretty instant way, like poetry does, with the language. Well, so I started writing poetry when I was young, and in fact, the very first published poem I had was in the local newspaper when I was 10 years old, and I was so excited because we had a poetry contest. And I think it really gave me some insight that it was something that I could do fairly well. The other aspect of poetry that I really like is it's almost like a secret code. Sometimes you can write about something that is that subtopic, and people don't have to know what you're writing about, because you're writing about describing a flower, but you might be writing about love underneath, or something political, or all kinds of different depths you can have in a poem. That's how my writing has evolved, is learning those tricks. And by studying poetry and studying other poets and being involved with other writers and being involved with other poets, my poetry has improved. Some of the themes, like I said, themes can be, anything from political to love to nature, and the forms that it takes kind of depends on what I'm currently studying. So I don't have an MFA. My master's is actually in education, curriculum and instruction, with a focus in literacy. So I've studied a lot of elementary level books, and because I worked mostly as an elementary school teacher. And so my reading has been a lot of children's books. And so I love the themes that are in children's books that teach us a lesson or have a moral to the story, a lot of those kinds of things, like parables. And so when I started reading parables as a reading teacher, I wanted to learn how to write a parable. And so I would get involved in writing parables, and I would write a lot of them until I got better at it. The same goes for my poetry. And so on my nightstand every night, I have one fiction, one nonfiction, and one poetry book. And so I'll study other people's poetry to help influence my poetry and help me make a better poet in the forms that they use. So some of the challenges that I've overcome is getting published. Like I said, I still celebrate the fact that the very first poem I had published was in the local newspaper when I was 10 years old, because becoming a published author is a very difficult thing to overcome. Publishers don't think about poetry as something that a lot of people want to read, so they're going to not publish poems when they could publish something that's written in prose and is more likely to be read by a wider audience. So becoming a published poet was, as an adult, became more difficult. So one of the things I chose to do is all three of my books are self-published books, my collections of poetry. At the same time, you have to submit. So you submit to magazines, you submit to contests, you submit to newspapers, wherever you think that someone might be able to pick up a poem, that you have a poem that connects to what that publication is, you submit poetry. And the biggest thing is getting all those rejections. I will say that I tracked my poem for 1 year, and in 1 year I submitted 75 times, and each of those submissions were 3 different poems, 3 original poems. Out of those 75 submissions with 3 poems, I only had 2 of my poems published. And so taking that rejection is something that's difficult and can be devastating to some people. And now I just count that as a badge of pride. And so it's like, yeah, I'm still submitting poetry, and I'm still doing this. I'm lucky enough to say that I've won 2 Boynton Awards in Washington State, which is a pretty big deal in Washington State, as being not only published but winning 2 awards. And that is because of my diligence of being willing to continue to put myself out there and get those rejections. Well, number one, read poetry. Read the poems that you don't like. Read the poems that you do like. Try to figure out why you don't like some of the poems. I was never, ever a Shakespeare poet. I don't like sonnets. I don't like iambic pentameter. I don't like the constraints of it. So I forced myself to read some of that so that I could learn why it is beautiful in its own right, and so I could learn how to do some of that myself and take what I like and leave the rest behind. The other part of being a poet is find other poets to talk to communicate with, and to critique your work and critique their work, because we always learn from other people. We can't learn it on our own. Even with me saying that I've read all these books and I've done a lot of self-study, my best advice is if you can find a poetry critique group, so you can sit down and say, okay, I'm going to read your poem, I'm going to give you some positive feedback, some negative feedback, and I want you to give me some positive feedback and negative feedback about my poetry. It is the biggest learning device that I've been able to find. In fact, I'm still part of a poetry group in Washington State, because I've only been here in Corpus Christi for 2 years, and I haven't found a critique group. So I'm planning on starting a poetry critique group within the next few months. That's going to be open. It'll be free. We'll probably be meeting at a small little bookstore once a month or something like that, to take your poems to and say, how can I improve this? How can we make this better? And I invite anybody who's interested to contact me at my university email address and tell me, I'm really interested in joining this critique group. Maybe we could start one here on campus.